During the first room workshop on experimental psychopathology, we have Professor Davey as a guest, professor at the University of Success and editor of the Journal of Experimental Psychopathology. Professor Davey, which is the actual role of experimental psychopathology in clinical psychology?
Experimental psychopathology is very important in clinical psychology research generally, because basically it brings experimental methodologies to the study of psychopathology, and that's extremely important. It brings controlled conditions and enables us to do experiments. Those experiments tell us something about the causal links between events, between causes and symptoms, and that's extremely important for things like model building and theory building in psychopathology. Another thing we can do with experimental psychopathology is that we can do experiments on healthy individuals, and that will tell us something about the processes that lead up to symptoms and psychopathology problems generally, what the causes are and what the etiology is, because in most cases it's the case that a lot of disorders are caused by perfectly normal psychological processes, and of course we can study those in healthy people.
In your opinion, which are the critical aspects in the clinical application of experimental psychopathology?
Because experimental psychopathology is about mainly normal psychological processes that contribute to psychopathology, it means that we can actually go and look at other core areas of knowledge in psychology and bring those core areas to a study of psychopathology. And that's very important because there's a lot of knowledge out there about standard psychological processes like attention, learning, decision-making, memory, and those are all factors that are important in basically understanding how symptoms develop. So that's very important. Secondly, I keep going back to the importance of experimental method. And it's so important that clinical psychologists are trained in good experimental method. And experimental psychopathology can offer that.
Last year, the Clinical Psychology Division of the British Psychological Society, BCP, started a debate about the dominance of the biomedical model of mental distress in psychiatry. What do you think about the relationship between experimental psychopathology and biological psychiatry?
Well, in principle, I think that experimental psychopathology ought to be neutral on that issue, because it's as much about doing research on psychological processes as it is doing research on biological processes, for example. I think the main problem with DSM and other diagnostic categories is basically that there are a lot of disciplinary lobbies, especially like psychiatry and neuroscience, for example, who want to try and identify biological markers for mental health problems. And they want to do that because they basically want to align DSM with medicine, and that's the way they would go about it. I suspect that if we were to do lots of experimental psychopathology studies, we would find that most mental health problems are not categorical. You don't suddenly get an illness, for example. They are basically dimensional. So we know that with problems like generalized anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, that they're dimensional. And so that kind of suggests, no, we shouldn't have diagnostic categories because the cutoff is purely arbitrary. And I suspect that experimental psychopathology can add something to that.
Thank you very much. We have finished. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you.
Very much.